So it's week 7, and I get it that a lot of folks are probably thinking, why did they bother drafting some of their teams at this point? We've had so many injuries. Of course, we've been trying to manage through bye weeks, and of course, the debates over who's the starter and who's not. I've seen so many tweets and social media posts about whether or not it's Kenneth Walker versus Zach Charbonnet. It's been crazy, but still, we have our teams to manage. And to help out with some of that, here tonight to try and walk through either Guillotine Leagues, redraft strategy, whatever you need. Both myself and, of course, the co-host with the most, Matt LaMarca. Like, LaMarca, what's going on, man? And how are you managing through 6 weeks of action, nothing but craziness, international games, early morning games, all that stuff? I mean, how are you doing through 6 weeks?
Yeah, I do what I think most people should do in relation to the early games, which is just pretend that they don't exist.
Yeah, that's to the Jalen Warren managers from a couple weeks ago.
Well, yeah, that was rough. And my condolences to anyone who got stuck with Jalen Warren in their starting lineup. But certainly, we need to acknowledge their existence from a fantasy standpoint, setting our lineups. But like, as far as just watching these games,
Yeah, no.
it has not been the most pleasant experience. I can only imagine waking up, as an East Coaster at 9:30 a.m. It's not that bad. Waking up, like, for some of these people on the West Coast, you wake up at 6:30 a.m. to go watch the Jets and the Broncos just have a rock fight. Like, I can't do that, man. I can't do it.
No, and actually, so I was on so I do the morning show for Yahoo on Sunday mornings, and part of the graphics that they use to update the game is they try and take the top scorer from each team and say, like, all right, well, here's kind of a game break. Here's how the game is looking so far from a fantasy standpoint. The top scorer for the Broncos, I believe, through 3-4 quarters, I think it was either Bo Nix, Cortland Sutton, one of the normal guys for Denver. For the Jets, it was Nick Folk, the 40-plus-year-old kicker. That was their best fantasy performer throughout most of the game. And I believe it probably ended the game as their top performer. So that is what we get. We're not sending our best over to London. So if you're watching this from across the pond, as they call it, I do apologize for the product that we gave you in week 6. But still, we're moving on. We're off to week 7. And again, drop your questions in the chat if you have anything. We try and use as much of the tools here at Fantasy Life, whether it's the utilization report, the trade analyzer, stats, projections, whatever we can in order to answer your questions and get you set up for week 7 and beyond. But as we're waiting for a few more questions to drop into a chat, I see Brainburst. What up? What's going on, Brainburst? How you doing, man? And of course, Chris Hop, Elite Content, Gents Bauer slipped through waivers in the league, got him for $0. I mean, that's crazy, man. I mean, well, if there's better to be lucky than good, is that the phrase?
It's why you have to bid on every player, right? Yeah. Even if it's just for a $0 bid or a $1 bid, there are times when the rest of your league just kind of falls asleep at the wheel. And it's a good transition because we have a few interesting waiver targets to talk about heading into this week, right? Like 2 of the 3 biggest disappointments in terms of chop rate were Puka Nacua. He had a chop rate nearly 20%. And then Garrett Wilson was the number 3 player. And both of those players are going to miss some time, right? Nacua, it seems like he is sort of unlikely to play when they go overseas to London in week 7. And then his team has a bye in week 8. And then for Garrett Wilson, he could be out even potentially longer than that. So it's kind of a situation very similar to Bowers, where you've got guys who they are, potentially end game players, but they might not get the attention on the wire that they usually would because they are going to be missing for an extended period of time.
Ask you about that. And for folks that didn't catch the show last week and haven't tuned into some of the Guillotine content, whether it's content that you yourself put out, LaMarco, or anything from the great Paul Charchian and the rest of the crew that does the Chop podcast throughout the week, what do you mean by endgame player? Now, I'm a comic book nerd, so I at least can attribute the term endgame to something that's going to completely shift or have a tectonic type of impact to your roster. Is that really what you mean when you say end game player? What do you mean by that?
Yeah, I almost mean it even a little bit more literally.
Okay.
Like, when you get to the end of the season, is this a player that you would feel comfortable having in your starting lineup? So, like,
Okay.
week 14, 15, 16, 17, when there's only 6 teams or fewer, right? The player pool is inherently much more condensed. There's going to be just a handful of quarterbacks and tight ends starting. You're going to be talking about the RB 14 in weekly rankings might not be a viable option anymore. End game player to me is somebody that, like, regardless of the size of the league, you can compete with that player in your starting lineup. So Puka Nakua, obviously end game player. He has been the slam dunk wide receiver one when healthy this season. Garrett Wilson, it's a little closer. He's probably more in that, like, wide receiver 10-ish type range. He's got elite usage, but he does it for a terrible team.
Yeah.
So for Puka, it's like, how much can I bid? Because I obviously want him. How much can I bid where I can survive without him for 2 weeks and then get him, if I make it to the finals, I have an end game spot locked up at receiver. Because that's the thing. If you, let's say you go very aggressive on Nakua, you bid $400, which would
Mhm.
be a lot. If you get chopped, he's just right back on the wire again next week, and somebody else can pick him up, and they don't have to deal with the fact that he might not play for one of the remaining games. So it's kind of like a little bit of a delicate dance.
Mhm.
And I think for Nakua, it's still worth going after him aggressively. 200, $250, something like that. But for Wilson, it's definitely a little bit more. I'm keeping a little bit more in reserve. So maybe something more like in the 50 to 100 type range.
Which that absolutely makes sense. And just given the situation, relative situations for both those wide receivers, you could see why you would want to be as aggressive, but I say aggression with some level of caution regarding Nakua, because to your point, few other wide receivers are in the type of situation where the targets are concentrated to the wide receiver position. Because for the Rams so far, it's not like anybody is rushing out to pick up Tyler Higbee. And even when Kyron Williams has been used as a receiver, it's not to the extent of a Christian McCaffrey, a Saquon Barkley, those types of guys. So having Nakua so far, 32% target share, and this is just using some of the utilization report information that's available on the site. You get that tier 2 subscription. You get to at least compare and contrast how each of those receivers are being used relative to their teams. Nakua is third amongst all wide receivers right now with a 32% target rate. He is one of, I believe, like 7 or 8 wide receivers right now with a plus 30% target share. So you are looking at, to your point, Lamarco, one of the wide receivers that if you make it to the promised land, which make it to the playoffs, those are those types of guys that you would want to have on your roster. So thinking about wide receiver usage in those terms, it is comparing not just the type of player that they are, but how much they're going to be used. And if you are put in that situation, if you do make it to weeks 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, and so on, those are the types of guys that you'd want to have on your roster. So comparing him to Garrett Wilson, where yes, Wilson also sits in the same, I'd say, level of usage or in the same tier from an opportunity standpoint, plus 30% target share as well, around 8-9 targets per game. Like when actually it's been independent of who's been under center for the Jets. But still, if you look at the amount of production for the Jets as compared to the Rams, I would say I would want Nakua just a little bit more than Garrett Wilson. So that's where we're trying to figure out not just the usage, but also the amount of potential production their offenses warrants a little bit more of a discussion regarding how aggressive you want to be on the waiver wire for either one of those two wide receivers. So yeah, I'm with you, Puka. If you can get him right now, even with the injury concern, let's assume he's going to be out for week 7. They go on bye in week 8. And even if it takes a little bit longer for him to ramp up and be back to full strength, you do have one of those types of receivers that you're playing the long game at this point. Is that the right way to kind of phrase it?
Yeah, I would think so. And I do think, just steering this back towards where our conversation started, like, if you're going to get one of these two players on an under the radar type bid, it's Garrett Wilson, right? Like, Puka, even with there being some injury uncertainty, I would be shocked if he goes for less than like $200 in just about every single league that there is. Unless, in some leagues where everybody has just blown through all their fab already, like there's just no shot that he's going to be a slip through the crack type player. I could see that being a much more realistic scenario with Garrett Wilson, where everybody just says, like, I'm kind of on the fence. I don't necessarily want to burn a roster spot on him. He's not somebody that is in like my long-term plans. So you could potentially get Garrett Wilson for like 40, $50. And really before last week's game, which was against a really tough Broncos defense in a weird London start time, like he had been really reliable, even if the Jets passing attack hadn't been getting the job done, Wilson was still getting his pretty consistently. So I think Wilson is like the exact type of player that even if you don't want him, you need to just put something on him to avoid a situation like we just saw with Brock Bowers, where he's going to go for far less than he should. So even if you're not necessarily ending up with him, you're at least playing some sort of defense so that the other people in your league can't steal a potential wide receiver one for nothing.
See what you're saying. So if I'm looking at it from the stance of, yes, is there a chance that the Jets put up another crummy type performance like they just did in week 6? Absolutely. With the way the offense has been looking, that's fine. But still, from an opportunity
almost assuredly will happen.
Yeah. But from an opportunity standpoint, it's hard for us to pass up a wide receiver that has that level of opportunity when they're in their offense. And especially or maybe another way to say it is we are now at the intersection of his value is not going to be too terribly lower given the injury situation, the way that the Jets are looking right now through 6 weeks, and especially after their London game on Sunday. It's that he's going to be at a price point that will be affordable, because if you had asked the same question, or if Garrett Wilson had been on the chopping block or out on the waiver wire, let's say 2 to 3 weeks ago, I would assume, LaMarco, would it be reasonable to say that if you're saying, and even looking at Chart's recommended bid amount right now for Garrett Wilson, $30, I would assume it would have had to have been at least double that if he had been on the waiver wire about 2-ish weeks ago. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, and one of the things that Chart does include in his article is what the average winning bid was for each player the previous week. So for Garrett Wilson, it was somewhere between like 150 and 200, I want to say.
Yeah, last week's median price, 175. Yeah.
Right. So you can get him potentially at a pretty significant discount given all the factors that we just talked about.
That's another interesting point. And here's why I really do like walking through these thought exercises with you week in and week out, is seeing that type of thing, because I'm almost of the same mindset that I was talking earlier. If I saw Puka Nacua on the waiver wire versus Garrett Wilson, sure, both of them are injured, but like we were talking just a few minutes ago, I see Nacua as an end game type player. I do not see Garrett Wilson as an end game type player. So I would try and be as aggressive as I could to pick up Nacua. Whereas with Wilson, maybe I'll put in a couple bucks here and there. But however, as we're talking through it and seeing how, from an opportunity standpoint and also a value standpoint, I'm getting a wide receiver one as of right now, and looking at the discount that we're getting for the same receiver that, again, still averaging 8 to 9 targets per game. Yes, the offense is, I would say, volatile at best, just to be kind. That's where trying to pounce on this type of situation where his value has been depressed so much given the situation that we see with the Jets offense, it's at least worth it to try and pick up a wide receiver like that versus somebody else in your league grabbing them for like we're seeing right here, this massive discount.
Yep. I mean, again, when we talk about guillotine leagues, if you're playing to win, right, which should always be your goal, you should always be playing to win. You need to have 8 endgame players at the end of the season. So maybe Garrett Wilson is an endgame player, maybe he isn't, but let's say if he does continue to trend towards being a wide receiver one, you could potentially get an endgame player for $50. That means you have way more fab available to attack the remaining spots on the waiver wire as you get closer to the championship.
That completely makes sense. All right. So this is one way that you can try and set your rosters up. And as you're going through the waiver wire over the next day or so, try and find some of those players that you think would fit into that category. And also, if you do see some players that you think might be on a discount from a waiver wire standpoint, even if you think the vibes might be as poor as possible, try and acquiring them just for the opportunity to allow you to get through those next few weeks before we start really talking about playoffs. And that is the way that you can try at least position your roster so that you're in the best spot to really attack the waiver wire from a fab perspective once it's weeks 10, 11, right before we kind of get into the playoffs. I guess a quick question for you, Lamarca. Is there anybody else on the wire potentially right now that kind of falls into that end game type player status where if they are on the waiver wire right now, you would at least advocate for being somewhat aggressive in terms of spending for them to pick them up right now? Is anybody kind of fits into that based off of who's been chopped the most over the last couple of days?
Yeah, so I mean, Jahmyr Gibbs was the number 2 most shot player. He is certainly an end game running back. You could be aggressive with him, but the guys to me that are the most interesting are specifically Justin Jefferson. He was the
Okay.
4th most chopped player. And if you look at his upcoming schedule, it's not great. He's got Philadelphia on there, and he's got the Chargers 2 weeks from now.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like he's another player. I think you factor in the uncertainty at quarterback in Minnesota, and people might be a little bit lukewarm on Justin Jefferson. We know about the talent, right? But like for just pure fantasy scoring right now, is he a true wide receiver 1? That's a larger question, right?
Yeah.
But the most interesting part about Jefferson, specifically for Guillotine Leagues, is he's now done with his bye week, right?
Mm-hmm.
Barring injury, Justin Jefferson is somebody who is going to be in your lineup for every week for the rest of the season.
Mm-hmm.
Like, and when those types of players come up, we saw it last week with Bijan Robinson and Roma Dunze. Like, you can be a little bit extra aggressive because,
Mm-hmm.
particularly with the early bye weeks, this is why Charch and Brian Johnson, who do the Tuesday show, are so staunchly against drafting players with early buys. It's just much harder to survive when the player pool is deeper than replacing players later in the season, right? Like if you have a week 14 buy, if you make it to that point, you're replacing that guy with an RB2 for fantasy purposes at worst, wide receiver 2. Like there's just more players available. A week 5 or 6 buy, you are still competing with upwards of 12 teams in your league. It's just much harder to replace that production. So you look at a guy like Jefferson, who now has his bye in the rearview mirror. He can help you whenever your team may have bye trouble in the next few weeks, right? Week 8 is a big week for buys. I believe there's 6 teams on bye in week 8. We've got a lot of games coming up here where we're going to see, big time fantasy players on the sidelines. In week 7, it's only 2 teams, but they're 2 important teams, the Bills and the Ravens, right? Those are teams that we have reliably gotten fantasy production from. Well, Baltimore, at least until Lamar Jackson went down. But, 2 elite offenses with a lot of guys who you can count on for fantasy purposes. If you, with a guy like Jefferson, you just don't have to worry about that anymore. As long as he's healthy, he's going to be in the lineup. And that is like, it's valuable in all leagues, but it's worth its weight in gold in guillotine in particular.
I hadn't even thought about that aspect of it. And now that as you were talking through it, it makes all the more sense because if you look at the opportunity that Justin Jefferson continues to get in that offense, agnostic of who's under center,
Mm-hmm.
still you would want to value him as close to a wide receiver as possible, just given the quality. I mean, the quality of those passes can be somewhat diminishing in terms of how we would try and value him, but still, if he's clearly the wide receiver 1 for the Vikings, he is somebody that you'd want to have on your roster. But to your point, if it's now an early season bye week where kind of tough to replace him, but now if we're talking about, let's say, compare him to, and I just want to look it up real quick because I think they do have a later season bye. So let's say compare him to Jamar Chase. I think their bye week isn't until around like the week 10, week 11 timeframe, if memory serves. And now, even with it's going to be Joe Flacco throwing him the ball, his opportunity compares well to what we're seeing from Justin Jefferson. And so trying to replace Jamar Chase, like once we get into week 10, somewhat easier, right? Because a few more teams are going to be eliminated at that point versus in week 4, 5, 6, where some of those other wide receivers, Justin Jefferson specifically, a little bit harder to replace his type of production and his level of opportunity in his offense. So no, that completely makes sense. And so you would at least, given his situation, would still say he's worth trying to pick up and be somewhat aggressive on, not just because of his opportunity, but also the fact that you don't really have to worry about any, like, trying to replace him at any point throughout the rest of the season, right?
100%. In Guillotine Leagues, the greatest ability is availability.
Yeah.
Always. So like if it was a rest of season type thing, I'd probably have Justin Jefferson ranked a little bit higher than Jamar Chase just because his bye week is already out of the way. Like that's the power of having a player like that on your roster.
Oh yeah, I dig it. Okay, so that's a solid nugget that I hadn't really considered beforehand, but still, that's just another wrinkle to having to try and manage some of your guillotine rosters. So definitely something to keep in mind moving forward. Couple of other things. So we're talking about bye weeks. Kind of segues into my next question. And of course, if you have any other questions or strategy discussion or topics that you'd like us to cover, drop them in the chat. Lamarca and I will use every tool that we have at our disposal here at Fantasy Life to try and answer your questions and get your roster set right. But question for you, Lamarca. So we're talking about end game guys and even, let's say, a couple of under the radar type of guys. And I wanted to ask about a specific under the radar bucket of players, and it's the rookie wide receivers. And now I'm not talking about the high end guys like your Emeka Bukas, even though he's injured as of right now. But some of those other wide receivers that some folks might be interested to pick up after their bye. Matthew Golden, in particular, for the Green Bay Packers, just this past week, showed up with a decent box score coming out of the bye. And then, of course, Luther Burden, who just played in prime time on Monday night against the Commanders, also looking like he was popping off the screen a little bit here and there. I think it was his highest target share of any game so far through 6 weeks. So those are the types of guys that, at least in my mind, I would kind of characterize as the players I would want to toss a small bit out here and there for, just given their usage and hoping that, as folks have looked at historically, that post-bye rookie bump, we could potentially project for a bit more usage for either of them. But do either of those guys really fall into that category that you would want to acquire them? Or just given their situation, you're just saying, well, yeah, that looks great and all, but I'll leave them for somebody else to pick up?
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't really have a ton of good feelings about most of the rookie class, specifically at receiver. I mean, certainly, like you mentioned, Emeka Egbuka, he looks like he's a locked-in fantasy starter at this point, at least whenever he's healthy, right?
Yeah.
Tedero McMillan, he's had some of those same quarterback concern questions, but the usage has been excellent. The production's trending upwards. I'm very comfortable with him. After that, it starts to get a little dicey. I still like Matthew Golden as a player, but he just has so much competition for touches, right? They've already sort of got 3 receivers that they like with Dontavian Wicks, Romeo Dobbs, and Golden. You're getting Christian Watson back, Jaden Reed at some point potentially.
Yeah.
Tucker Kraft is there. And then, of course, Josh Jacobs is there to absorb 20 carries a game in the rushing attack. And it's pretty similar to Luther Burden in Chicago, right? There's a lot of mouths to feed in that Bears offense, especially with Rome Odunze taking a step forward and becoming like a true wide receiver 1 this year. So I think for the most part, if you are looking at these rookies, they're kind of bridge options to get you from now until sort of the later middle of the season. And that's why the guy that is the most intriguing to me right now is probably Tez Johnson.
Okay.
Maybe not the MVP of the league like he mistakenly thought the fans were chanting at him, but
Yeah.
he might be a fantasy MVP for us in week 7. Elite matchup against Detroit and their, just banged up, horrendous secondary. They're going to have even another player down in safety Brian Branch, who got suspended after cold cocking Juju Smith-Schuster. So like Tez, he had an 84% route participation last week. He's going up, right? Because that game was with Egbuka, and now Egbuka is going to be sidelined. So I think for sure Tez is a viable starter. So like if you're looking for help this week, I think Tez is basically the best band-aid that you're going to find at the position. And maybe you only use him for 1 week, and as the team gets healthier, he slides back into, sort of a supplementary role, but those guys have immense value right now, and I can, sort of improve my roster without sacrificing a ton of my salary cap. That to me is a win-win situation.
Yeah, and that's where I think we talked a couple of weeks ago about trying to find those smaller value type of guys that can get you through your week. And if that's really all they provide is that 1 week type of bump, so that yes, they pop off in week 7, but in week 8, let's assume that Mike Evans is back healthy. We'll see about what either Chris Godwin or Emeka Egbuka look like after a week of rest, and their role starts to diminish within the offense. Of course,
Millen is theoretically still alive, right? Like he
oh yeah,
still
I completely
exists, and
forgot about
he's
him.
he's not just a figment of our imagination anymore. Like
Yeah.
it would be nice to see him at some point. He had some moments down the stretch. So yeah, it's a crowded passing attack, but
Mhm.
Baker is playing as well as anyone in football right now at the quarterback position, and you could have a guy who could be his number one pass catcher, at least for a week. I was looking at our rankings earlier. We have him, Tez, that is, sort of as like a low end wide receiver 3. I think that's a little bit too bearish for me. I have him,
Yeah.
significantly higher than that. I think I would feel comfortable using him as a wide receiver 2 next week.
Yeah, I completely agree. Just given the nature of the Tampa Bay's passing game so far, pass rate over expectation has been healthy enough that, let's say, even if Tez is a, let's say, 3/4 of the routes type of guy with the limited number of pass catchers in an offense, I would assume that he should be able to rack up enough targets to at least be viable from a 1 week standpoint. Because outside of him, who are we really expecting to create pass game production for the Bucks at this point? Cade Otton, Sterling Shepard. And again, if Mike Evans plays, just given how long he's been out, we can't assume he's going to take on the full wide receiver 1 role that he's historically had. So even if Bucky Irving was healthy, I wouldn't expect him to take on like that much more from a receiving standpoint. So I'm with you. I would still put him in. I would definitely put him more in like the mid to low end wide receiver 2 range, and that is just at a minimum. If we continue to hear or see more from his development from a practice report standpoint, and how much Baker is really trying to get him more involved in the offense, and I could see him being pushed up even farther than that.
Yeah, and also don't sleep on Cade Otton. It might end up being a situation where, just like last year when the team was down Chris Godwin and Mike Evans, Cade Otton was the tight end 2 from like week 6 through week 11, something like that. So, yeah, I think all the players you mentioned, all the guys that are healthy right now for Tampa Bay, have at least some level of startability. Sterling Shepard, he's kind of the most borderline to me, but
Mhm.
you add in like the matchup, the amount of routes and snaps these guys should get, and just the way that this offense is played in general. And yeah, I'm pretty bullish on Tampa heading into week 7.
Yeah, because just looking at where Tez has been deployed, at least in the 1 game sample, more of the downfield type of threat, while still running like more of the intermediate routes, where Sterling Shepard is more of your short area of the field slot type of player. So even if the targets are there for Shepard, yeah, I'd say a 5 for 55 type of stat line would be more in the realm of Sterling Shepard. Whereas with Tez Johnson racking up air yards as he did just in week 6, that at least gives you both the and also the targets that we would assume being the semi quasi wide receiver 1A, 1B, whatever you want to call it, with the number of injuries that the Bucks have sustained. I would at least be able to see how we get the floor ceiling combination from Tez Johnson, where Shepard seems more like a floor play. Cade Otton, with how we've seen him, to your point, Lamarca, be the tight end 2 once a number of injuries went to the Bucks passing game back in 2024, he could ascend into that mid to high end tight end 1 type of outcome for Cade Otton. But still, for Sterling Shepard, I would put him in the wide receiver 3 bucket, whereas Tez Johnson, he seems more like a wide receiver 2 for me.
Reasonable.
So, talking through it a bit more about some of the other guys that might stand out so far, looking at some of the other chopped players from week 6 moving into week 7, does anybody else stick out for you? And again, pulling up some of the free content that's available on fantasylife.com, talking through some of the players that might be on your waiver wire. One of the guys that at least I would have initially thought, and again, I'm trying to switch from my redraft brain over to Guillotine Leagues, Quinshon Judkins.
Mm.
The level of opportunity he's had in that offense, completely displacing Dylan Sampson, Jerome Ford, and operating as the team's RB1 after missing week 1 entirely and just having 5-ish games under his belt. I would think he would be the guy that most folks would try and pick up. But do you see him as a guy that, again, you see the name, you almost want to pounce on trying to acquire him on your team, but is he somebody that you're looking to acquire, but really it's just like, no, leave him from somebody else?
No, price has got to be right for me. He's a great player. I am a big time believer in his talent, but there are two big concerns for me with him. They are the Patriots in week 8 and the bye in week 9. So if you put all your eggs in the Quinshon Judkins basket, you've got to deal with, a rushing defense that has been really, really good this season. And then you have to get through a week 9 bye. The other side of that coin is that Judkins does get the Dolphins this week, and he could legitimately carry your team across the finish line by himself in that matchup. So it's a bit of a risk reward type situation, but I'm not really at the point yet where I can say confidently that Quinshon Judkins is an endgame player. So I'm not going to go super aggressive for him. Someone out there is going to like him, I would imagine, more than I do rest of the season fantasy purposes. Like, again, as far as the player goes, extremely excited about what we've seen from him. But playing for a Browns team that is starting, a guy who's probably not an NFL starting caliber quarterback, a team that really is not going to be super competitive in most weeks, it's harder for me to get excited about, shifting my chips into the middle for Quinshon Judkins.
No, that's completely fair. And looking at, again, some of the data that's available on Fantasy Life, at least in this particular article, seeing Quinshon Judkins, his median price from last week, $205. So if I'm thinking on a $1,000 total budget, that's 20% of what you would expect to have to pay for him. That seems a bit rich just compared to some of the other running backs that you could probably get for much cheaper that can get you through this week. And Lamarca, as you laid it out, having a solid matchup this week, tough out in week 8, and then also going on bye in week 9. I would at least want to try and find some other running backs that can get me either more prolonged opportunity or production versus having to pay again up to 20% of my budget coming at like for a Browns running back, just even with the level of opportunity he's been able to get so far through 5 games into his career. But all right, looks like we've got a question in the chat real quick. Let's see if we can answer Mick Burkhat's question here. Bit the bullet and spent fab for the first time. Landon Cook and ETN have 7-10 remaining. Cam Johnson and Jawan Jennings are available. Worth grabbing them over Bam Knight, Tyler Algier, or Tajay Spears. My first guess looking at this, I don't want anything to do with either of those two guys. Maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah, I Cam Johnson to me, like, as long as the Steelers continue to win football games, what's the incentive to work him into the rotation? I think that they're pretty happy with what they're getting from Jaylen Warren and now Kenneth Gainwell. Like, they've got a solid 2-man tandem. It's hard for me to say Cam Johnson's going to break into that anytime soon. Jawan Jennings is a bit more interesting, but again, like with San Francisco, theoretically, George Kittle is going to be back. He might be back this week, and Brandon Ayuk is going to return at some point. We're going to still have Ricky Pearsall to deal with as competition. So it's like very possible that Jawan Jennings becomes like the number 5 option, adding in Christian McCaffrey, like behind those 4 guys. So I like the three that you have on the bench better, I would say. Certainly Tyler Algier. I think Tyler Algier is like the most valuable handcuff in fantasy right now. If something were to happen to Bijan, Tyler Algier's an RB1, right? Like a weekly RB1 for the most part.
Mhm.
Tajay Spears had more utilization and was more productive than Tony Pollard last week. And with the way the Titan season has gone, it wouldn't be a huge shock if he starts to take on a bigger workload. Um, Bam Knight is kind of the outlier. He might be the one to go. If you did want to make a move, like I wouldn't be super upset if you were like, I want to get rid of Bam Knight and pick up Jawan Jennings, but it's really like, how much do you think it's going to cost you? If you wanted to make that move on like a $1 to $5 bid, sure. But if it's going to cost any more than that to get Jawan Jennings, I just don't think that moves the needle enough for me.
No, and I don't know. You probably saw the same reports that I did about Jennings saying he's playing through 5 broken ribs, a low and high ankle sprain. I'm really hoping that's on 2 different legs, because how can you have a low and high on the same leg? That's insane to me.
He's going to be out there on a roller skate next week.
Pretty much, either that or like a wheelchair just gassed up or whatever to get him down the field, because I don't know how he's out there playing with that level, with that many injuries that he's trying to work through. But to your point earlier, if you can pull up the utilization report for for the Steelers right now, and this is kind of why when I saw Cam Johnson's name, I just had so many questions about, is this guy even going to be somebody that you would want to have like on your roster? And this is where seeing how much they were just completely fine with trying to split the touches between Jaylen Warren, Kenneth Gainwell, why trying to invest into that. Again, I have some general concerns about trying to make sure that you're capturing some of that backfield where, and this is really just something that we're going to have to continue to at least monitor, but trying to pick up Johnson at this point, even though, yes, it's good to see him back into some sort of rotation after the earlier parts of the season with him getting no touches. And then, of course, the fumble, and then Mike Tomlin talking about just keeping him away from punt and kickoff returns after the fumble. At least seeing him get some touches, I think, is fine. But with Jaylen Warren playing so well and being able to operate as a receiver, same thing with Kenneth Gainwell, especially in the game that Jaylen Warren missed, trying to at least capture a piece of the Steelers' backfield doesn't seem like the best idea, at least in my mind, especially after seeing this 3-way split. But I don't know. Do you see it differently, Lamar?
Oh, he says Cam Johnson of the Bucks, so I'm assuming you mean Tez Johnson of the Bucks. Because we did a whole good 15 minutes on the Buck situation.
Yeah.
And Chris and I are very much in on Tez Johnson. So yes, especially if you need a wide receiver for this week, I think Tez is he would be much higher than Bam Knight in my week 7 flex rankings.
Yeah.
I would feel much more comfortable starting Tez.
Yes.
Assuming that we got the player right, and that's the guy that you're referring to.
Yeah, I kept thinking, go say Cam Johnson, and then I saw the other running backs, and I was like, the only K Johnson that came to mind was the Steelers guy.
Yeah.
And I was like, wait, I don't think his first name is Cam, so maybe I'm missing something here. But no, so I'm assuming, hopefully you're right, Lamarca, that he's talking about Tez Johnson. And of course, we did talk about him a bit ago, saying for week 7, absolutely. If you can go ahead and snatch him up, he should be able to get you through to week 8. And then we'll figure out what the rest of the Bucs passing game is going to look like once everybody starts to get healthy. But for right now, yeah, absolutely. I would go ahead and pick him up. Okay, so about 40 minutes in, got another 20 minutes trying to talk through as many of the questions that you've got, and appreciate folks dropping some stuff in the chat so we can, again, pull up as many tools and the models and projections and whatever we've got here on the site, because we've got access to so much content here at Fantasy Life, talking about either Guillotine Leagues, redraft strategy, whatever you've got. I mean, we are here to try and help you out as much as we can. And again, trying to get ready for week 7, but still trying to talk through some of the other situations that are going on throughout the league. And one of the ones that I was talking about in the intro, Lamarca, I wanted to ask you about it. should anybody be starting either of Kenneth Walker or Zach Charbonnet at this point? It just feels like it's been too much of a 50-50 split that either one of them, even if either one of them wind up on the waiver wire, I don't want to pick either of them up. I don't want to start any of them. At this point, they are just a part of the offense powered by Sam Darnold. And it really just, to me, seems like it's just Sam Darnold, Jackson Smith and Jigba, maybe a dash of AJ Barner. But when it comes to those two running backs, the opportunity split between the two of them has kind of put it on a point where I would almost assume we're going to see them being, either one of them being one of the most chopped players, just given how much they've disappointed fantasy managers through 6 weeks.
It's a weird situation because the Seahawks are like 27th or 28th in pass rate over expectation. Like, theoretically, it's a good spot for a running back. This just gives me like 2018 Packers vibes with Aaron Jones and AJ Dillon.
Yeah.
And it's like, we see these two players, they're playing in the same offense. One of them is awesome and one of them is not. And why do they continue to split the touches so evenly? Like, it's kind of maddening. I think Kenneth Walker is just a really good player. So I would continue to start Kenneth Walker. Like, the usage the last couple of weeks hasn't been great, but I mean, he just went up against an elite Tampa Bay run defense and he averaged 8.6 yards per carry. Like, he's just awesome in my opinion. And Charbonnet, I would not be comfortable starting him, but he needs to be owned just in case something happens to Kenneth Walker. Like, we have seen that when one of those running backs goes down, the other one becomes immensely valuable for fantasy purposes. So even just if you wanted to look at it as like a handcuff type situation, Charbonnet to me is like a top 5, maybe even top 3 handcuff in the NFL right now. Kenneth Walker, I think, is good enough that he can pay off that, return value even with Charbonnet healthy. But in reverse, Charbonnet needs a little bit health in terms of injury.
Yeah, and that's why it becomes so much of a headache for fantasy managers, seeing Charbonnet being used on the goal line, getting those money touches, but still it's Kenneth Walker that's still ripping off explosive plays and getting some of those chunk gains. But then once they get into scoring position, swap him out, Charbonnet's in there, and then he winds up either getting enough cracks from the goal line that he can get in, or there's enough wasted attempts that we're all just screaming at the TV that Clint Kubiak should be putting Kenneth Walker in there instead of Zach Charbonnet. And it's frustrating from that standpoint. And that's where, at least even from a redraft standpoint, I would have concerns about trying to start either of them, just given the split between those two touches. But to your point, having Walker as the starter, but still rostering Charbonnet just in the event that Walker's foot injury that he suffered throughout the offseason that kind of aided to him lagging or having the fewer snaps at the first couple of weeks of the season, and giving Charbonnet that runway to really force the committee that we're seeing right now. That's at least something that would at least want me to push me to have Charbonnet or somebody like Charbonnet on my roster. But yeah, trying to figure out which week is going to be the week that Walker winds up getting to the end zone versus Charbonnet or whomever. It can definitely be frustrating, but still, I'm in the camp of Walker is the better rusher of the two versus Charbonnet. But given their usage, it's tough to try and figure out which one we should be starting.
Yeah, I mean, at least if you look at like fantasy finishes with these guys, Charbonnet has been much more like volatile, right?
Yeah.
Running back 43, 25, 26, 70, and 26. Walker, on the other hand, has been pretty consistently in, the top 25-ish area. Last week was a clear outlier. The Seahawks just didn't have the volume for some reason on the ground, but RB 27 or better in each of the 4 weeks, 2 top 10 finishes over that stretch. Like, I still think you can feel pretty comfortable starting Kenneth Walker. I'm not saying he's an end game player, but at this point in the year, like, we still have 12 teams left in most Guillotine Leagues. You've got to start 2 running backs and 2 flexes. Like, yeah, Kenneth Walker to me is still a starter.
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, at least a guy, and if I'm thinking about it from a qualitative standpoint, finding a guy that's at least going to get you enough touches that he can get you through your week. He's not going to give you a complete dud, but at
Yes.
least something that will get you through your week and won't be the reason why you wind up getting chopped. Because I would say compare Kenneth Walker to, let's say, another backfield duo situation that's really not giving us much of anything, and that's the Patriots running back situation. Travion Henderson, if you drafted him with an early round pick, you're probably a bit upset with the early season returns, but I would say at least Kenneth Walker has to be miles ahead of what our expectations and also the results for Travion Henderson. Still, Henderson can be the reason why you lose your week. Walker, I don't think is in that same category.
Yeah, essentially, like Charch always talks about, you want to have a 10-point floor. And I feel like in a PPR format, Kenneth Walker is pretty close to 10 points. Maybe not exactly 10 points as we saw last week. He can have a clunker, but he still didn't show up as one of the 10 most chopped players last week. So, like, I think that his role is safer than maybe, you know, the some of the utilization numbers might suggest.
No, I think that's fair. Yeah, I definitely think that's fair. A couple more injury type situations, or just I would say wide receiver situation I wanted to ask you about before we get on out of here tonight. And again, appreciate folks for dropping in their questions like throughout the show. If you got any other questions about guys you should be picking up, trades you might be wanting to initiate or trying to get into negotiations for heading into week
JSN,
7. Oh, yeah.
JSN, good pickup, I would
Yes.
say.
Yeah, pretty solid pickup. I'm pretty sure he's up there in terms of PPR points per game. His rapport with Sam Darnold, pretty good so far. So yeah, definitely solid pickup for you. Never had it so good. Yeah, I don't have it that good because I can't find wide
No.
receivers like that in my league. So no, solid pickup on your end. But speaking of wide receivers, did want to ask you real quick about the Chiefs wide receivers situation because
Ah,
they've got Rashee Rice coming back. And so I would assume for managers that drafted Rashee Rice, knowing he was going to have the 6-game suspension, would you advocate for starting him this week in his first game back? Because we've got Hollywood Brown playing well, Xavier Worthy's still out there kicking around. Even Travis Kelce can wind up falling into the end zone at some point, and any of the running backs are also starting to work into the receiving game. So even though Rashee Rice last season before he got injured, averaging around 9-ish targets per game, 30% target rate with Patrick Mahomes, now a much more crowded offense. If you waited this long for Rashee Rice, would he be the type of receiver that you're rushing to get into your lineup from a guillotine standpoint, or do you say let's hold off and see what his usage is like before you start him?
I'm firing him up with confidence.
Okay.
I think looking at our week 7 rankings, he's pretty much like a round wide receiver 10 for most people. I think that's, kind of the medium projection, right? Like if Rashee Rice comes in and he has the same usage that he had before he got injured and then suspended, we could be talking about a guy who's like a top 3 or 4 option at the position for the rest of the year.
Mhm.
So I feel pretty comfortable with Rashee Rice. Like there's still a lot of targets to go to him without necessarily taking away from guys like Xavier Worthy and Travis Kelce to a lesser extent. Like, unfortunately, rest in peace to my guy, Thornton. I think
Yeah.
that experiment is pretty much over. He was great. He gave them some really good production when they needed it, but I think Rashee Rice is going to make him pretty irrelevant. Hollywood Brown to me becomes a part-time player. We've already kind of started to see that. Juju Smith-Schuster, thanks for showing up. You put in some good work for us. You took a punch literally while we were getting healthier.
Yeah.
And now it's time for the Rashee Rice show. So yeah, I think somewhere 25% target share is, I think, even on the conservative side for him. Like he's good. I have no qualms about his level of ability, his chemistry with Patrick Mahomes. I like the fact that it's not like hasn't been healthy enough to play. Like there may not be an easing in standpoint in terms of It's not like he has to get up to game speed. Well, he might have to get up to game speed, but he's healthy and theoretically should have been doing stuff while he was suspended. So yeah, I think it's pretty clearly all systems go for him.
And I think that's fair because like we just saw with Jordan Addison, who had to serve a shorter suspension, he just came right back to the Vikings offense. And even with Carson Wentz throwing him the ball, slotted right into that wide receiver 2 role, had that shot down the right sideline when they played in London, if I'm remembering correctly. Even though, he got caught from behind on that deep shot, like I was just mentioning, it's still the target share was there for him. And looking at our projections coming into the week, and of course it's Wednesday, either Dwayne or Friedman might make some adjustments to how they're projecting this Chiefs passing game. Rashee Rice all the way up at the top, 8.1 targets in his first game back. So fairly similar usage to what we saw back in 2024. So I do agree with you that, and I think the one thing that you pointed out that I wasn't really at least factoring in, it's not like he's returning from injury. It's not like he's returning from a point where let's see how he feels or trying to test things out and make sure that he's ready to play at the NFL level. He's just been suspended. He's just been off, like away from the team because of the suspension. It's not like he has to work his way back from any sort of injury. So having him at 100% health, whereas with Xavier Worthy, he has been banged up for the past couple of weeks. And of course, Juju Smith-Schuster taking that shot to the face last week at the end of the game. That's where I could see a scenario where Rice really just slot, pun intended, right back into his previous role with the Chiefs offense. So I'm completely with that as a way to, if you waited this long for him, start firing him up in week 6 makes the most sense to me. I did want to.
I think it's also fair to say the Chiefs are back from a passing game standpoint. Patrick Mahomes right now, QB1 in fantasy football in terms of points per game. He's averaging like close to 25. We've seen 3 straight excellent performances. And that they still can't run the ball, right? Like the Isaiah Pacheco and Kareem Hunt, Brashad Smith, like none of these guys can run the ball. So it's just going to be Mahomes, and more Mahomes. And I expect Rashee Rice to be their top guy.
I'm pretty sure, correct me if I'm wrong, but hasn't Mahomes been their leading rusher 2 straight weeks, something along those lines?
He might be their leading rusher for the season, to be 100% honest.
You're probably right, man. You're probably right. That wouldn't shock me at all. But yeah, so points well taken. Having him on your roster, if you draft him, you waited the month and a half in order to start him. You're firing him up in week 7. One other guy, and never had it so good, had a couple more comments. So he picked up JSN for 152, Nico Collins for $87, Sutton for 37, and Baker with Josh. Sutton for 37 and Baker with Josh on bye, winning week. Absolutely. Yep. Wanted to ask about Nico Collins. Coming out of the bye, so you were talking earlier about having a wide receiver 1 with that type of target share that it's going to be fairly consistent that you want to have, and getting their bye week out of the way early allows you to just essentially set it and forget it. For Nico, though, I guess my general concern is just this Texans passing game and how often we see CJ Stroud under duress. So many times that he's been hit so far throughout the season. I think he's probably 2nd or 3rd in terms of quarterback hits so far. I do have my general concerns about what Collins can be from a wide receiver standpoint for the rest of the season. But does he also slot into that type of receiver where situation be damned, it's just the level of opportunity that he has, and his bye week is over, put him in your wide receiver 1 and we'll just sim to the rest of, like, to the playoffs, that type of thing.
Yeah, I think if Garrett Wilson was healthy, right, you could feel similarly to Nico as you do about Garrett Wilson. But But Nico is healthy. He's passed his bye, and he's catching passes from CJ Stroud. And CJ Stroud maybe is not the same quarterback that we all thought he was going to be when he took the league by storm as a rookie, but he's still better than Justin Fields. So, I feel more than comfortable with Nico in my starting lineup. Sort of in that same tier where maybe if I make it all the way to the end, I'm considering whether or not I want to bench him for somebody a little bit better. But I think over the next, 5 to 6 weeks, especially, he's going to be very helpful with his production.
Yeah. And to your point, just thinking about the quality of his targets right now, Nico Collins sitting at a 69% catchable target rate, which is less than at least a couple of the other receivers that are currently on his team right now. Because he just plays that type of, he's just that archetype of receiver where plays on the perimeter, catches those balls like farther down the field, 11.8 air yard average depth of target so far, like through the 5-6 games that he's played. It's just going to be harder for him to rack up yards, but he's still getting the target share. 25% target rate so far from CJ Stroud. It's the volume is there, but since he's not getting those layup type targets either across the field or in the short area of the field, they're going to come in chunks, not just one target at 5 yards or 6 or 7, and then it's really just racking up the volume and also the yardage from after that. It's just more one catch for 40 yards and then 3 uncatchable targets afterwards, then maybe another catch for 20 or 30 more yards, and then the rest of it kind of goes after that. But he is one of those receivers that essentially, he sticks out to me as a guy that we considered a wide receiver one, and rightfully so, given his past production and how he's using the offense. But given his situation, it's almost like similar to the Garrett Wilson thing. But as you compared to him, they really are the types of guys that you would still want to have on your roster, given the amount of usage that we're getting on a week in, week out basis.
Yeah, even if you want to ding him a little bit, I still don't think you're ranking him much lower than like wide receiver 15. You know what I'm saying? So, and speaking of the Texans pass blocking, I don't know if you saw, I want to say it was against Tennessee a couple of weeks ago. They had what had to have been the worst pass blocking snap in the history of professional football.
It was like 0.2 seconds that the guy was in the backfield. Yeah, it was in Tennessee.
Center literally snaps the ball, doesn't block the guy who's right in front of him. And like literally all 5 guys on the offensive line try to block the same player. And the nose tackle just swallows CJ Stroud in less than half a second. And yeah, so I'm not saying it's CJ Stroud's fault at all. And certainly like these circumstances could be a lot better in Houston, but I still think as far as the target share and stuff goes, like, yeah, Nico's still very trustworthy at this point.
Yeah. So start Nico Collins and let's leave CJ Stroud on either somebody else's bench or the waiver wire. That might be the best way to approach it, just given how poorly their blocking unit has been. And even as a Bengals fan, I feel for the Texans in terms of how often they're seeing their quarterback on the ground. It's not the best situation to be at. So, okay. Well, I think we said it all here for week 6 going into week 7. Again, if you ever have any questions about Guillotine Leagues, redraft strategy, trades, whatever the case may be, well, Mark and I will be here Wednesdays, 6 o'clock, answer all your questions, pull up as many tools, the utilization report, our projections, whatever you need in order to figure out how best to situate yourself for your Guillotine rosters heading into the following week. So either way, thank you so much for joining us today, popping into the chat. I'm Chris. That's Matt LaMarca, the wonderful producer that we got for this show. But until then, we'll catch y'all next week.